Good evening, everyone. I wonder if I could encourage you to take your seats. My name is Maureen Sheik, and I'm a Vice Principal here at Queen Mary. And it's my pleasure, first of all, to welcome you all to this evening's discussion. And then to introduce our chair for the evening, John Lloyd. John Lloyd is contributing editor of the Financial Times, but he has also acted as Labour editor, Industrial editor, East Europe editor, and Moscow bureau chief, as well as having been founding editor of the Financial Times Weekend magazine. He has also served as editor of Time Out and also New Statesman. John co-founded the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism at the University of Oxford in 2006, an international research centre for the comparative study of journalism, where he is now director of journalism. He has written or co-written many essays and books, including The Miners' Strike 1984-85, Loss Without Limit, Rebirth of a Nation, The Anatomy of Russia, published in 1998, and What the Media Do to Our Politics, from 2004. John is an associate of Demos, a member of the editorial board of Prospect, and a member of the board of the Moscow School of Political Studies. And it's my pleasure to invite him now to chair this evening's event. Thank you.
Many, many thanks, and good evening, and thank you for coming this evening. Our theme is the media in Russia, and as many of you will know, because many of you will be reading it, or reading about it, thinking about it, you will know that it's a controlled media, one that is not wholly free, some would say not free at all. And we have three people whom I'll introduce to you in a minute who will address that. But I wanted to start with putting perhaps what might be a contrary position. I wanted to put to you what a couple of Russian journalists, both of my acquaintance, have said about Russian journalism, and the people here might argue with that or agree with that, I don't know. One of them is one of the best-known columnists in Russia. Her name is Yulia Latinina, and she works for the newspaper for which the most famous victim of the quite a few murders of journalists. The most famous of these was the murder of Anna Politkovskaya, who wrote extensively about Chechnya, won awards for doing so, and was a staff writer on Novaya Gazeta. Yulia Latinina is also a columnist on Novaya Gazeta, and she, in a talk she gave at a seminar that I was at, said of journalism in Russia, she said, of course, there's much more freedom in the West. Indeed, the situation in the West is simply incomparable to that in Russia. But the situation in Putin's Russia is also incomparable to that of the Soviet Union. There is state monopoly over television, but there is no state monopoly over newspapers or the internet. While it is indeed the case that the majority of Russians watch TV and vote for Putin, they are free not to watch. If they don't exercise their right to read newspapers and online news and interpret the news, it is simply an indication that Russia has not so far reached boiling point. The other is from a friend of mine who is also Russian, but is the correspondent for a British newspaper, weekly magazine, The Economist. His name is Arkady Ostrovsky, and he's written in an essay which is about to be published, an essay which goes over the development of media in the Soviet Union under Gorbachev and in Russia under Yeltsin and through to Putin and Medvedev. He says, while Gorbachev's perestroika was a genuine attempt to open up the country and reform its political system, Medvedev's modernization is an imitation like much else in Russia. What is interesting, however, is that while Medvedev is trying to fake changes, the demand and anticipation of change is growing, particularly among the younger, more restless set. The media is once again reflecting and projecting this trend. And he goes on to give some examples. Glossy lifestyle magazines are becoming as political as the thick literary magazines were in the 1980s. A magazine for the rich Russian elite, appropriately called Snob, recently put a photograph of Lyudmila Alexeyeva, an 83-year-old human rights activist, on its cover. The Russian version of Esquire is filled with serious critical articles about politics, life and the economy. And a few years ago it published an important epistolary exchange between Mikhail Khodorkovsky, the ex-tycoon turned political prisoner, and Boris Akunin, Russia's best-known writer, and so on. Now these testimonies to what's happening in the Russian media mean that it's not simple, it's complex. It isn't Brezhnev's Soviet Union, or indeed even Gorbachev's Soviet Union. It's something rather different. And we're lucky tonight to have three people who will tackle that, who know a great deal about it. On my right is Georgi Bovt, who's a former Izvestiia editor, and now is a critic and commentator upon the Russian media. At the far left, as befits a man from The Guardian, is Luke Harding, the Moscow correspondent in absentia for The Guardian. Recently had the distinction, which I never quite managed when I was there, of being thrown out of the place and not being allowed back in. He's also the author of a recent book published by The Guardian with co-author with David Lee on WikiLeaks. He was one of the major editors of the WikiLeaks revelations which The Guardian published some time ago. And on my immediate left is Masha Lipman, who's one of the best known commentators on Russian society and politics, and she's at the Carnegie Center in Moscow. There is an empty chair, you may have noticed, and that should have been occupied by Irina Demchenko, who's the bureau chief of RIA-Novosti here. Irina has succumbed to food poisoning, more benign, I hope, than some other poisonings that take place with Russians, and can't be with us tonight. But she did send a message which I will read to you, which is her view of what's happening in the Russian media. We had asked Irina in order to give more of a, if you will, official view of the media in Russia, but if this is the official view, the officials have changed a bit. Point one, she says, press freedom is one of the core pillars of democracy, as well as the freedom of elections, the independence of justice, the freedom of meetings, and others. It can only exist and operate in collaboration as these freedoms serve each other and support each other. If any of these basics of democracy are limited, the others will be affected. The second point, I believe that most people in power, especially at the very top, and especially if they stay there for a certain time, sooner or later come to the conclusion that press freedom doesn't really help. They're serving complicated and highly responsible duties 24/7 for society, and all this unnecessary criticism in newspapers, all these cartoons and comments and leaks and speculations and sketches, it all doesn't really help. And I don't speak now necessarily about the post-Soviet or Middle Eastern leaders. Berlusconi is a very clear example, as well as the recent case when Obama's administration tried to exclude Fox TV from the pool as they didn't like the coverage. I think this desire is sort of natural for political leaders as they rule the world. That's why in democracies there's a very strong counterbalance, which is civil society. For civil society, media is absolutely vital and significant. Russia is a country with a number of fascinating, brilliant, smart, brave, intelligent individuals who unfortunately don't constitute the fabric of civil society. Some of them form groups of campaigners, but these groups don't organize society. Point three, I'll shorten a bit. She says, in a contradiction to what I said in my second point, Russia once had a unique period when a leader in power personally considered that press freedom was an independent value. And that was Boris Yeltsin. Yeltsin could be sick, drunk, terminally ill, but as soon as he heard about the threat to press freedom, he would come out of bed, go to the Kremlin, and stand there to protect it. And he handed all possible freedoms to editors, editorial managers, and journalists, protecting media both from the officials and their shareholders. However, what has happened more recently is that, she says, a pack of wolves came to kill our sheep. I mean, taking television under state control. When that happened, nobody among the audience came out in the streets to protect it. On the contrary, after all what happened, was the public saw returning media under government control as a logical and clear way to stop the appalling information wars. So that's from Irina. I'm going to ask Masha to follow that, to speak first. Everybody has 10 minutes at the most, so we can have some time for discussion.